Thank you very much, Mikołaj, for that very nice introduction. I'm going to just speak informally. I was press-ganged into this at the last minute on the understanding that Mikołaj's career will be in ruins if I didn't turn up. So, being a humane philosopher, I said yes. But, of course, I came without anything specific to say, except that I thought perhaps I could just explain how I see philosophy and why I think this is a very important question, whether, if I understand it rightly, whether philosophy is a humane discipline or rather something more scientific, whether it is, as Locke said, the handmaiden of the sciences, or whether it is, as I prefer to say, the handmaiden of the arts, or whether it's neither. And we all have this great question in our minds, let's say all of us who have got involved in philosophy, as to what it is ultimately you're trying to achieve. So I thought I'd say a few general things about this. Obviously, ordinary people, when they're confronted with the idea of philosophy, think of it as something like the propagation of a worldview. That the philosopher is someone who has an account of the way things are, which will enable people to orient themselves towards the world, distinguish the true from the false, perhaps, and the good from the bad, and in general impose order upon the otherwise fragmentary nature of our experience. And then, of course, we live at a time when order is rather a precious commodity, and philosophers seem to be the least likely to provide it. So I think inevitably, therefore, philosophy goes through a kind of crisis of identity in this condition, and there is in the air all these theses about which Professor Rosinska has already mentioned, about the crisis of culture, the crisis of the European sciences. That's Wissenschaften. That's as we know, it's a book by Edmund Husserl, which introduced his later reflections on what philosophy could do, and by way of restoring confidence in the realm of humane knowledge. The word crisis and the idea of the death of God, of art, of philosophy, of civilization, etc., these have all been on people's lips. Some might say rather too glibly over the last 150 years. And I was interested by Professor Rosinska's reference to Wittkatz's notion of the death of art, that somehow art is no longer possible, something that was proved to him by the invasion of Poland by the Red Army, which led to Wittkatz's suicide. We've had this thesis thrown at us by George Steiner, that the death of tragedy. Tragedy is no longer possible after Auschwitz, and so on. All of this, is quite an industry, really. People, one of the ways of advancing as a professor in the humanities is to say that there is no such thing anymore. And it makes me feel that there's something suspicious behind this. Wittkaczy, by the way, if anybody wants to know what a great portrait painter he was, they should go to the senior common room in Trinity College, Cambridge, where there is Wittkaczy's portrait of Casimir Louis. Some of us here have had the good fortune of knowing Casimir Louis, the Polish logician who taught me logic at Cambridge in his heyday, and he, for some reason, there is a portrait there in the senior common room of Louis, a beautiful portrait of him when young by Wittkaczy. Wittkaczy was a really distinguished painter, and also a literary man as well, wasn't he? A poet and dramatist, and he a close friend of the greatest modern Polish composer, Szymanowski. They lived side by side in Zakopane, as I recall, in the mountains. Anyway, Wittkaczy committed suicide. So with him at least you can acknowledge that he was sincere in his judgment about the death of art because he put it promptly into action. But I suspect that other people who talk about these things are not really convinced. Okay, so it is the case, nevertheless, that we live in an era which is discontinuous with the philosophical tradition that we've inherited. After all, we're living in the world after books, which is a catastrophe for someone like me who makes his living by writing them. Okay, there are books still occur, but they exist in cyberspace, and they're in competition with the exhalations of morons by the millions, and there is no easy way that we can do anything about this. It's fine for Nick to refer to, with Adorno, to the impoverished in spirit marching joyfully into the inferno, but the problem is they make us march alongside them. And that inferno, which is there on the web, is a kind of nothingness. There it is. All words evaporate in this black hole. And it's an irreversible process, like the black hole, that there's a total loss of information at the horizon of a black hole. You cannot, from the succeeding state of the universe, work back to the condition which things were in before they entered that hole. And it could very well be that nobody will be able to work back from the black hole of the internet to the condition that human culture was in before it entered it. And that's all very sad too. However, here we are in this room talking about humane philosophy, and I think I'd like to say something a bit more positive than that. We who were brought up in the analytical tradition obviously think of philosophy primarily as an exercise in conceptual clarity. We try to clarify our concepts and to study our arguments in the light of their validity. So clarity and validity are all important. There is a question, however, of what the results of this are. The results seem so disputed that many people wonder why people engaged in this exercise. Isn't there something they've left out? I want to say a little bit at this point about why one might think that philosophy has another area of inquiry than simply the area of logical analysis, and why it might actually be useful for us to engage in that inquiry. We're all familiar with the scientific worldview in one form or another, which aims to give an account of what there is in the physical world and to explain it in terms of the laws of motion which generate one state of affairs from its predecessor. And that model of scientific explanation, variously modified and adjusted, is one that's accepted, I think, widely in the philosophical community. And if you were someone like Quine, of which there are no examples apart from Gilbert Harman, but suppose you were someone like Quine, you would think that was all that philosophy could do, add its weight to the enterprise of science and give us a complete account of the physical world in terms of its laws of motion, which would also be an account of our thinking and how our thought relates to the world. Thinking, after all, is a natural phenomenon, just like any other, ought to be subject to the same kind of laws. But I think that once we look at it, we'll see that there is such a thing as humane understanding, which isn't a part of scientific explanation and uses different concepts and uses them in a different way to generate a different kind of knowledge. And I'll just give a few simple examples, which I'm sure are very familiar in one way or another to you, and not necessarily in the form I shall relate them. One that I find quite useful is the concept of an ornamental marble. Sculptors and architects had to understand this concept in the old days, in the days when architecture still existed. And they had to know how marbles could be combined, how the light is reflected from each of them, and how they could be joined in structures and so on. There was a kind of vocabulary of them, which you see exemplified in the Church of Santa Croce by Alberti in Florence and in many subsequent things. Now, ornamental marbles include marble, which is an allotrope of calcium carbonate, of which another allotrope is chalk, which is not a marble. Okay, so two things which are, from the point of view of physics and chemistry, classified together, are not don't fall under this classification. Porphyry, which is a silicate like sand, is an ornamental marble. Onyx, which is an oxide, is one, and so on. You've got a whole stream of these instances which cross all the available scientific categories that give an explanation of their behaviour, but form one category from the point of view of our human use of them. The use that a sculptor or a funeral monument maker or an architect would make of them. So, and we know why we have that concept, because there is something that we do which involves knowledge of a completely different kind. Knowledge not just of the properties of these things, but knowledge of how to combine them, how to make of them a background to human life which is acceptable to the kind of creatures that we are. A more metaphysical example is one that has always appealed to me, which is that of the image in the picture, where we know that the scientists can give us a complete account of the Mona Lisa or whatever in terms of the distribution of chemicals and coloured patches on a two-dimensional graph. And you could discompose it, if you like, into pixels, so it could be programmed into a computer. And that description would be a complete description in the sense that it contains enough information to reproduce exactly what you see. But you have all that information to reproduce exactly what everybody sees, but not be able to see the Mona Lisa herself. So that's something you see in the picture when you approach it in another way. And it's something which is not over and above the coloured patches in which you see her, but yet, nevertheless, as I say, it's not an additional physical feature, but nevertheless, somebody who didn't see it wouldn't see all that is there. And a more metaphysical example is that of sounds and tones in music. Pitched sounds in sequence can be heard as a melody. Not necessarily. Some people are tune deaf or tone deaf and don't hear melodies in sequences of sounds. But from the point of view of the science of acoustics, all there is in a sequence of pitched sounds, are the temporal order of the events and the frequency of vibrations of those events, plus all the overtones that they set in vibration as well. All that can be described perfectly and plugged into a machine through the right algorithm, and indeed that's exactly what happens in all those things that you plug into your ears at every moment of the day. And probably nobody in this room is quite that bad, but you know what I mean. Again, the perfect sound engineer who could do this so as to reproduce exactly what is needed might not be able to hear music. Because to hear music, you have to hear something else. You have to hear in those sequence of sounds something beginning, moving through a space of its own, a one-dimensional space of its own, passing through various moments of closure, coming perhaps, if you're lucky, to a conclusion. And that process with the spatial dimension in which it occurs is fundamental to our understanding of music, and yet, of course, is something which is, in some deep sense, not there from the point of view of the science of acoustics. We need the concept of melody, concept of movement, concept of gravity, of attraction and repulsion, all those things we need if we're to not just describe music, but also hear it. We hear it according to concepts which are no part of the science of the phenomenon. Another interesting case, which I think is, again, familiar to most of us, particularly to people brought up in the Anglosphere, is that of the relation between interests and rights. Human beings have interests, and as a result of this, they enter constantly into conflict with each other. And these conflicts are resolved by force or whatever, or negotiation. But a social scientist interested in the behaviour of the human animal might very well say that we are governed by these interests. These are, my desire for, say, for food, sex, sleep, and so on, and the more complex desires that come through my membership of society. And we can give an account of people's social behaviour largely in terms of the interests that compel them. But take a case where two sets of interests are in conflict. So somebody has planted a tall hedge along the edge of his garden because he can't bear the noise made by his neighbour, and the hedge casts a shadow over his neighbour's garden, killing off all the vegetables. Right, now, this is a well-known case of life in suburbia. These are two conflicting interests, but when they're taken to a court of law, they're not discussed in terms of the two interests in question. The question before the judge is who actually has a right in this matter. One of the parties might show that he has a right to light in his garden, in which case this hedge has to be cut down. If your interest is a mere interest and mine is a right, then of course mine, as Dworkin puts it, mine trumps yours. In general, courts of law impose upon the nexus of human interests this grid of rights and obligations through which the conflicts can be resolved. But there isn't anything in the nexus of interest which tells you exactly how those rights will be determined. They are elicited from the circumstances by a long process of legal reflection, a process which has been going on for 1,000 years in this country and therefore in everywhere that grew out of this country, including in America, which was brought to an end in Poland in 1939 and has never really recovered, as I think most Poles who've been in a civil conflict know, because the material isn't there which enables people with certainty to settle that here are the rights in this matter and here there's a mere interest. So there is another case where we find in the reality the objective rights that we discern there in something like the way we find the face in the picture and the melody in the sounds. Now, underlying all these things is the distinction, which I think is fundamental to the enterprise of humane philosophy, between the human being, the human organism, and the person. You are all human organisms, and there's a complicated and developed science of the human organism for which you are all grateful, because when you go to the doctor or undergo surgery, you want that doctor or surgeon to know that science and to put it into practice. You don't particularly care to have a personal relation with him, or certainly not with the surgeon. I think that would be the beginning of a catastrophe. But nevertheless, you want him to treat you as the kind of biological object that you are. But when you enter a relationship with another human being, whether it's an intimate sexual relation or just a relation in the marketplace where you're negotiating for a bag of apples or whatever, in whatever the form of the relationship, you don't look on the other in that way. You're not approaching him as a mere organism who responds to whatever electric currents can be stimulated in his nervous system and in order to produce whatever response that might produce. you respond to him in a completely different way, as a self-conscious centre of action. That's to say, somebody who not only refers to himself in the first person as I, but refers to you, as you do him. There's this I to you relation in which you are not trying to explain each other's conduct so much as to influence it through reasoning and through changing each other's conception of what is going on and of what is owed to each other. And this encounter, this personal encounter, which is fundamental to our life, is, I think, really at the root of what I would call humane philosophy, trying to understand what that extraordinary fact about us does to our condition, how it changes our condition from that of the mere animal, and what kind of response to the world is appropriate for a creature who thinks of the world in that way. So what do we build upon the relational nature of the human person, and how do we understand the institutions such as the law and religion and art which have grown out of this? And I think that is something where philosophy really has a role to play, where analytical philosophy has on the whole been fairly deficient, and it's one reason why people turn to continental philosophy in the hope that there at least something better might have been said. A hope destined, in my view, to be dashed, but nevertheless a hope worth maintaining for the time being. So and one of the most important features of this mutual encounter through which we become self-conscious persons is the fact that we take responsibility for things. That's to say, we regard ourselves as accountable to others, not just for what we do, but interestingly enough, for what we are, what we think, and what we feel. Being accountable for what you feel is one of the most interesting features of the human condition, and the need to both to be honest to what you feel, but also to be amenable, not to make offensive remarks, not to be bluntly truthful about what you feel about everybody at every moment of the day, so that so as to respond with what you really think about someone. This is a really difficult question. How you do negotiate this first step towards accountability, the step of being trustworthy without being brutally honest. As you all know, Cordelia, at the beginning of King Lear, makes the wrong first step, and while her father makes several, and the result of this is the destruction of both. And that play, which is a wonderful exploration of the I-you relation gone wrong, and the impossibility of recuperating it before it's too late, is, I think, a wonderful illustration. Shakespeare is philosophy in practice, of course, and he illustrates why it is that, in the end, philosophy ought to be more closely aligned with literature than perhaps it has been in the analytical tradition. And it's one reason why I always, in my much more amateur way, try and relate what I do as a philosopher to things like works of fiction in which I explore some of these issues. In particular, this issue on truth and trust. What happens when trust is taken away, when the surrounding circumstances are such that you can no longer assume, even in the very basic things, that someone is being truthful, because it's too dangerous to be truthful, but yet, nevertheless, you need those places, those sacred places, where the light of truth nevertheless shines on both you and the other. That is the situation which I describe in Notes from Underground, which is set in the old communist world. A world which was beautifully described, and he never gets credit for it, by George Orwell in 1984, where he shows the use of language in such a way that it is a mere instrument of power relations rather than a way of saying the truth. Interestingly enough, Foucault, who said that all language is like that anyway, is not given the kicks on the shins that he deserves for saying so. But Orwell actually shows what it means in the spiritual life of the individual. Right. So I just want to move on from that briefly. I think there's not much time, and I know you've had a hard day, as to how one might proceed along the lines of creating a humane philosophy which takes into account this fundamental feature of the human condition, that we're answerable for what we do, and we're answerable in the terms of the IU relation of giving an account of ourselves to the other, in which trust is one of the components. Now, one of the things that has interested me in aesthetics is the aesthetics of everyday life. When people study aesthetics in the academy, usually it's by way of addressing the philosophy of art, and usually in the analytical tradition, rather boring questions in the philosophy of art, like what is the difference between art and non-art? What is the identity of a work of art over time, etc. To which the answer is, art isn't a natural kind, so say what you want. Nothing hangs on it. But, a lot does hang on it, because there's a lot of careers that have been made out of it. And there are these theories about the death of art, which takes us back to Wittgenstein and so on, which perhaps have an interest in them. But I want to say that actually aesthetic thinking and aesthetic reasoning is a fundamental part of everyday life. And there really is an interesting work for philosophy to do, which is to show how it is that it enters everyday life, and whether there isn't some guidance that we can get from philosophy in the matter of applying it correctly. I think this is particularly important in the case of architecture, for the following reason. Going back to the 18th century, people then made a perfectly plausible distinction between the fine arts and the useful arts, in particular, depending upon a famous book by l'Abbé Batteux in Paris. And it was always the case that people put architecture along with furniture and clothes and so on among the useful arts, because it's not just that you try to make things look right and beautiful and so on. You've also got to perform a function, and the function is all important in the building. If you haven't performed the function, it hasn't fulfilled its primary purpose. And that, of course, is absolutely true, and it's a reason why this distinction is very helpful to us. But it isn't all that the distinction amounts to. In the case of the fine arts, say the composing of a work of music or a sonnet, or the painting of a picture, a landscape, say, the only thing that matters is the aesthetic value of it, and it's only the person who really can do something new and original or beautiful who actually has a claim on our attention. In the case of building and furnishing and sewing clothes and all the rest, we all have a stake in it. We all need to do these things, or if we don't do it ourselves, to depend upon others who do them. And we know that those people it's only in rare cases that those people will be real artists in the way that, say, Turner was a real artist in paint or Beethoven in sound. If we waited for the real artist in architecture, if we waited for Brunelleschi to come along, there never would have been a Renaissance city, because there would be nobody to live in it, no shelter or anything. So we do need the second rate, and the second rate are much more important than the first rate. So how are the second rate guided? The emphasis on fine art has given them the wrong guidance. It's always said, you've got to be a genius, just like everybody else. You've got to produce that original work that nobody could have foreseen, the equivalent of Michelangelo's Laurentian Library. And you can do it at the computer, I don't mind about that, as long as you shock enough people. And the result is what you see all over our cities today, especially in London, grotesque works of egomania on the part of second-rate people. Now, second-rate people are, I don't want to despise them because we're all second-rate. And the great problem with modern life is it doesn't make enough room for the second-rate. It divides reality between the first-rate celebrity and the people who've got no hope. But actually, most people are in that other category in between and are wanting to get on with an honest job and perform an honest work of life, an honest piece of work. And so this is why I think in architecture especially, you need to think about how an ordinary person who has a sense of that things fit together and wants to make something that is agreeable would proceed. And one of the important observations which I want to defend about the aesthetic value generally is that our interest in it and our concern for it comes about, at least in part, from our concern for other people. It's getting things to look right in, say, setting a table is a very good example. You set a table for others, not for yourself. And the reason why you study symmetries and you don't think why you try and get things to harmonise, why you make things look warm and welcoming, all these are aesthetic values, aesthetic features. Why you worry about this is because you worry about how you fit in to the society of which you're a member. So that the pursuit of aesthetic value at this level has its roots in social membership. Now, I know that's not an analytical thesis, it's a slightly genetic thesis, but nevertheless, if you take it seriously, I think you'll recognise why it is that in things like building, furnishing and decorating, the primary judgment that guides you is not the judgment that that's beautiful, it's a judgment that that's right. It looks right, or it doesn't fit. It should, a bit there, move it up a bit, yes, that's right. Wittgenstein makes this point in his lectures on aesthetics, and he's right about it. That is the way people think, and it's the way he thought when he designed that house for his sister in Vienna, which you can still visit, unlike his sister. The Bulgarian embassy took it over at a certain stage when it was proved to be uninhabitable, and as a communist embassy it suits very well. And it does have some very beautiful things in it, we have to admit that. Okay, so so this idea of fitting things together, making them look right, demands a certain kind of order, and this really is the origin of the classical idiom in architecture. The classical idiom being based around the orders, which divide the column into significant parts and say this part goes with that part, this with that, this answers that, and you learn architecture by learning how to draw those parts, fit them together, understand the way the light falls on them, how you continue them from side to side, and so on. In other words, there's a kind of decomposition that you understand, and then how to generate the whole out of those parts. And you learn this as you might a grammar. It does in some way correspond to what Colin McGinn was earlier referring to, the SAE package. That we discompose things into significant parts and then learn how to join them and subsequently to evaluate them. I don't think it's quite like grammar. It isn't purely rule-guided. It's more a matter of convention and adjustment. But still, it's got something in common with those very basic organisational abilities, organisational competencies that Colin was referring to. And I think this is an interesting fact, and perhaps is something to pursue further in understanding everyday aesthetics. It's a matter of getting things right. It isn't a matter of necessity, however, but nevertheless it's that there is such a thing as getting things right and learning how to get things right, and that's what was taught in schools of architecture. Now there are rivals, however, And this is where I think we do see the usefulness of philosophy in entering the sphere of cultural criticism. There are other ways of treating architectural parts than in terms of fitting them together according to how they look. You can discuss them from the point of view of their stress quotient, or their coefficient of expansion, and so on. You can go into all the science of this and program a computer so it will give you all the possible shapes that you can get for a certain height of building or using certain materials, and then you can put your finger on one of them and choose it according to whether that suits the client's requirement. And that's a completely different way of thinking about architecture, although it is the norm these days. Most architects don't learn even to draw the human figure, let alone to draw the shadow on a Corinthian capital at 12 o'clock in the morning, which is what their ancestors, or their predecessors, had to do. And this connects with something, again, which I think picks up on Colin's talk, that in all these activities, we are prone to ask the question, why? That question grows out of the accountability that we have towards each other, and it grows in the aesthetic context out of the shared enterprise that we have in building things so that we can all live with them. But the question why isn't one question. There are different kinds of why question. And in particular, there are utilitarian why questions. You say, what does this achieve? As opposed to intrinsic why questions. Why should I have that shape rather than another shape? What is it in it, that shape, that settles the question that it should be that? And we have a natural tendency to flee from those second kind of questions, those more difficult questions, because they are essentially demands to take responsibility for the thing. Whereas a utilitarian question, you can answer it according to the available science, and you are escaping from responsibility. It's not your decision. It's the decision of the materials itself, so to speak. The science itself tells you that this is the best means to support 14 stories of hideous glass. I add that last bit. You wouldn't describe it in that way. And this is at the back of what Heidegger, whose ability to speak lucidly was not of his greatest asset, but at the back of his mind when he talked about the crisis introduced into our civilization by the pursuit of techne, by making all questions into technological questions and making it look as though our approach to the world in general is that of using it for our own means and always finding the most efficient means towards some pre-established goal. And when that happens, of course, the world falls apart. That's what we've seen in modern architecture. The world has fallen apart. It's there, of course, in another sense, but it isn't our world. And we're not comfortable in the shadow of those buildings, and it's one reason why all Americans flee from their cities into the suburbs, where they can be comfortable, even though, there's a kind of inferno there too. Right, so just to conclude, what is it then that the other kind of why question is posing to us? It's if it's not a question of technique or the utilitarian question of the means to an end, it's something like asking us to arrange the world of appearances, to arrange appearances so that we are part of them and they are part of us, and we can be at home with them. The aesthetic endeavour is a matter of returning the world to us, so that buildings stand before us and remain with us, and are in dialogue with us. And learning how to do this is, of course, a cognitive process, but it's not one that we can assimilate to any of the naturalistic or scientific paradigms that interest someone like Quine, whose paradigm was physics and so on. It's a cognitive process in the sense that it involves genuine knowledge. There's a loss of knowledge, for instance, about ornamental marbles since this concept first came into being. Modern architects don't know how to use them. But the kind of knowledge that they've lost is not a knowledge of the scientific kind, or of how they can be a means to a particular end or whatever. It's knowledge of what they are for us in the relations that we have with them spontaneously as persons. And that, I think, so there's a role for the kind of aesthetics that I do in rescuing a little bit of culture from the crisis, and too late to rescue Witkatzy from suicide, but not too late to rescue the rest of you.